Welcome back to WNST. All Ravens fans, and it began with knees and national anthems and boos for calls to prayer and unity, and Luke Jones monitored all things offensively and defensively in a 26-9 loss that, quite frankly, Luke, as much as we're going to beat the offense up about this, the defense has really sort of slipped down the mountain as well. Beginning last week, it didn't really get a whole lot better, I didn't think, against the Steelers, and certainly the inability to stop the run, and where is Brandon Williams and where is the run stop? You can't have Le'Veon Bell doing that to you on a Sunday afternoon.
I completely agree. I mean, as much as we were talking and singing the praises of this defense the first 2 weeks, I mean, they pitched the shutout in Cincinnati, 5 turnovers, 5 more takeaways, and only 10 points allowed against Cleveland. It's really fallen apart here. And I want to get back to something that Dean Pease was talking about this during the week. And Ness, that I have been a bigger Dean Pease supporter than most, but he was asked about his defense's performance in London against Jacksonville, and he went on the defensive. He was, he flat out said he was offended at the notion that some reporter, some writer in town had said about the Ravens defense having disappeared, and he cited that their numbers against the run weren't that bad if you took away the fake punt last week. He talked about the fact that they were pretty good on third down, and he basically chalked all of it up to intensity. And I'll be totally honest with you, that didn't sit with me really well, because I think we all saw a defense that was not very good against Jacksonville. I mean, they gave up 3 touchdowns to Mercedes Lewis.
It could have been a lot worse. I mean, earlier in the game when they were kicking field goals, it could have been worse.
It could have been, but I'm sorry. When you give up 44 points and you go on the defensive and you kind of take a shot at and look, I don't take personally shots at the media. I just think it's kind of ridiculous when you give up 44 points and you're nitpicking things that the media said when it was very clear that their linebackers did not play well. They were poor in pass coverage. I thought a lot of the misdirection that Jacksonville used, they had issues with. So my point is, the defense didn't play well last week, and he kind of chalked it all up to intensity. And look, I think the intensity was certainly lacking. I certainly thought they were flat, but when you use a word like intensity and you kind of chalk it up to all on that, to me, you're almost just saying it was a player's effort and nothing else. And I saw an unimaginative pass rush. They tried to use a 4-man rush, didn't work against Blake Bortles. They had their issues in coverage with their linebackers. They had defensive linemen not playing particularly well for stretches of that game. I mean, yes, the run defense, if you take away that fake punt, it wasn't terrible, but it still wasn't overly impressive. And just in general, that kind of an answer, that kind of an explanation for last week, that didn't sit well with me. But if that were the case, if that were the truth, if he was absolutely 100% correct on that, then your defense would come out and play really well against an offense that, let's face it, I mean, the Steelers coming into Week 4 had been very pedestrian. Le'Veon Bell had not had a single game of over 100 total yards.
Hey, last week I had Steelers broadcasters, media people that cover the team, running in quicksand, running on a beach, slow, all of that. It looked like he hit some holes to me, and it looked like everything they wanted to do on the stretch they were just doing, and angles be damned, and quite frankly, tackling, which really was the early problem in the Jacksonville game, which was missed tackles, first point of attack. That was happening again all day on Sunday, and that's not good.
Yeah, and I mean, just the very first drive, and look, I mean, the offense plays a part in this because the time of possession was completely out of whack. At the same time, they gave up some really long drives. I mean, their very first defensive series, 16 plays, 84 yards, 10 minutes, 23 seconds. Are you kidding me? To try to set the tone when you're playing in your home stadium? That's not good. And, yeah, okay, they were able to hold them to a field goal, so it could have been worse, but that right off the bat just set a bad tone. And, I mean, Pittsburgh, they did a nice job running the football. I mean, they finished with 173 yards, 4.1 yards per carry. I mean, Dean Pease can't stand up, can't stick up for that. That's not good enough. That's not very good at all, especially when you look at how many resources pumped into this defense. And yes, they did miss Brandon Williams. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, this team in the past great defenses played without Ray Lewis on occasion. They played without Ed Reed on occasion. And you know what? They were able to come away with some good performances still, so you can't put it all on Brandon Williams. I thought their outside linebackers, Zadarius Smith and the other guys that were trying to set the edge, I thought did a poor job in that regard. To your point, some of the off-tackle stuff, they really got some chunk yardage. You're dealing with some inexperienced defensive linemen playing in there, so I'm not saying it's completely unexpected. At the same time, when you go out there and you let a struggling offense, an offense that hadn't done much of anything so far this season, and you let them completely run it down your throats the way they did, that set the tone for the entire afternoon. And you're right. as much as we're going to focus on the offense, and I'm way more concerned about the offense than the defense, full disclosure. At the same time, when you consider how many resources were pumped into this defense via the draft, via free agency, via re-signing Brandon Williams, and you look at the performance, they've given up 70 points over the last 2 weeks. That's not good. That's concerning. And yes, Brandon Williams is part of that, him not being out there. And Brent Urban, certainly, I think, not just against the run, but him as an interior rusher in obvious passing situations, I think that hurts because he's someone who was proving to be a force in that area.
Well, once again, this isn't the team Ozzie drew up, too. We're going to beat Ozzie up, and we'll be beating them all up. But, the guys that they expected to be on the field aren't on the field, and what's clearly on the field right now is not what used to be on the field 2 weeks ago.
It is, but at the same time, their linebackers and their secondary, that is what they drew up. Okay, Tavon Young, Ladarius Webb had some issues. There's no doubt about that. Is he ideally a nickel corner at this point in his career? No, and I think if Jalen Hill ever gets back on the field, I think you could see him in the mix there. So yes, they did lose Tavon Young back in June, but the rest of those linebackers and secondary, that's the group that they had, and I can't put it all on Brandon Williams and Brent Urban. There's still too many breakdowns. There's still too many mistakes being made, and while I don't think that this defense is bad per se, they haven't played very well the last 2 weeks. And with the offense being where it is, and considering all of the resources pumped in there, they have to be accountable too. They have not been good enough. I think Dean Pease needs to be accountable. I think the personnel needs to be accountable. It's considering what they have pumped into this defense, it's got to be a lot better, worlds better than it's been the last 2 weeks. It just has not been good, and you give up long drives. I get it. When the offense goes 3 and out, you start getting tired, but at the same time, how about you start by not giving up a long drive to begin with, and you're not as tired then. If you're trading 3 and outs, then there should be no excuse for wearing down. But
I still feel like they're chasing Le'Veon Bell right now. It just felt like it was all day long. And as a textbook kind of win and the kind of football that Mike Tomlin would want to play on the road with an aging Ben Roethlisberger and, on all of those parts, and the Ravens sort of reeling from these massive injuries to Yonda and Williams and Urban, this was a textbook Steeler game. There was nothing that should have shocked anyone, nothing about what I call the chicanery and the trickery and the misdirections and the underneaths, and, that's scripted Steelers. That's been going on for 20 years around here, back to Cower, quite frankly.
It is, and this was, as much as we've talked about Pittsburgh being a team that's thrown the ball so much, it was very apparent, the first 5 plays of the game, they gave the ball to Le'Veon Bell. They were trying to get him going, and as they should, in the same way that when the Ravens had an impact back, like when they had Ray Rice, like when they had Jamal Lewis, you would pull your hair out at the times where they didn't establish those players early, because you know what they can bring. You know how special they can be when the ball is in their hands. So, they were very wise in how they handled it, and the Ravens were not very good in stopping it. So, Brandon Williams and Brent Urban not being out there, that's certainly part of it. They're going to have to adjust. Brent Urban's gone for the year. Bronson Kafusi's a former third-round pick. Chris Wormley's a third-round pick this year, was inactive Sunday, but you figure he's probably going to be in the mix at some point. You hope they get Brandon Williams back, although pregame he was out on the field in a walking boot. And based on what John Harbaugh told us on Friday when I asked him about how Brandon Williams was progressing, he didn't necessarily indicate that return was imminent. So you might.
Well, walking boot on a 300-pound man is never a good thing. It just isn't.
I mean,
right?
you're probably talking at least the Oakland game, and then I think we'll see after that. So I mean, they're going to have to figure this out. And as much as you can kind of point to Brandon Williams and say, okay, him not being out, you expect some drop off. Yes, it's natural to expect that in the same way that the offensive line wasn't going to perform as well without Marshall Yanda. At the same time, teams invested a lot of draft picks on the defensive line, whether you're talking about Carl Davis, a third-round pick, Willie Henry, a fourth-round pick. I already mentioned Kafusi and Chris Wormley as third-round picks. These guys got to play, and these guys need to contribute. When you're talking about day one and day two picks, more so day two, I should say, these are guys that need to show something. And
well, this is their chance. This is their chance. They've waited their turn beyond all of the Chris Cantys and the veteran players that have been here in the comings and goings. This is the chance to get on the field.
It is, and they have to step up. And as far as how Sunday went, they collectively as a group didn't do a particularly good job in that regard. I mean, even some of the plays where they had Bell stopped, how many times was he able to get 3 or 4 yards out of it even? Instead of stonewalling them at the line of scrimmage, this was just a case where I thought Pittsburgh was more physical than them in the trenches. That's a Pittsburgh offensive line that was without their right tackle, Marcus Gilbert. But overall, even though they hadn't necessarily played all that well so far this year, that's a line that's gotten much better. I mean, one of the big Achilles heels of the Steelers over the last 6-7 years had been their offensive line. I think they've taken some steps to improve that over the last year or two. But, even those plays where the Ravens got to stop, instead of it being no gain or a loss of 1, they were still squeaking out 2 or 3 yards, and that adds up. How many times did Pittsburgh, even on that opening drive, they might have only gotten 3 yards a pop, but it put them in 3rd and 3. It put them in 3rd and 4. It put them in manageable situations. And, even though, they finished 7 of 15, 47% of their third downs they converted. I mean, that's pretty good for them. That's not good for the Ravens defense that was priding itself on being so good on third down. They weren't very good on third down, and a lot of that had to do with some of those runs.
Well, that's how you get the time of possession 36-24, right? I mean, it's just you can't get off the field. You can't get off the field.
Yeah, and a lot of those runs on first and second down, it just put Pittsburgh in third and manageable. That idea of staying, quote, on schedule, which the Ravens have had so many issues with since Gary Kubiak left, quite frankly. But they were able to do that very effectively, and that made it much easier for them on third down against the Ravens. So, they didn't stop the run very well. It's not as though Roethlisberger made a ton of plays in the passing game, but he converted some, certainly. Wasn't as though he had a poor game. He did enough, 216 yards on 30 attempts, compared to Flacco throwing 49 times for 235 yards. They were much more efficient than the Ravens, and this defense didn't necessarily give up a ton of big plays like what we saw, in the Cleveland game a couple weeks ago, where they gave up chunks of yardage, even though they were able to get some takeaways. But they made plays when they needed to. It was a pretty efficient effort by Pittsburgh, and the Ravens just they couldn't come up with big plays. Save for the one interception. They couldn't do anything to really swing the momentum. The one time that they did, the offense went backwards and had to settle for a field goal. So with the way this offense is playing right now, they need a lot more out of their defense, and that defense has not been up to the challenge these last 2 weeks.
Luke, defensively, I'm trying to think of things I'm liking about this or any part of this or players who are standing out in any way. And I know we've been beating up the organization for middle-round picks not getting on the field. I think Marlon Humphrey's going to be okay, right? I mean, of all the things I guess we've learned, C.J. Mosley's their best player. I think that's pretty obvious. You certainly get a lot of effort out of Weddle and Jefferson on various plays. That'll play itself out over the year. But if we're trying to find one guy that's ascending that we could point to and say, all right, well, maybe a star is born. Maybe Marlon Humphrey's that guy.
Yeah, I really like what I see from him. That's encouraging. There's no doubt about it. And I think you see the confidence that the Ravens have in him, that they have rotated him not just with Brandon Carter, but it's actually been with Jimmy Smith. And maybe that's a good idea to keep Jimmy Smith healthy. I mean, Lord knows we've talked about him not being able to stay on the field, perhaps giving him fewer snaps. And clearly he's going to be in there in crunch time. There's no doubt about that. But maybe that's the ticket to hopefully keeping him on the field. But, I think the perfect example, it was about the 10-minute mark of the second quarter after the Ravens had punted. They had punted from deep in their own territory. Pittsburgh took over at the Ravens, just past midfield, and they put Marlon Humphrey in the game. And he was matched up against Antonio Brown. It's a single high safety, so cover one. There's safety coverage over the top, but it's not quite like cover two where you're in man coverage and you got to stick with the guy because the safety might not get there in time. And right away, as they should, Ben Roethlisberger went right after the rookie, and he ran with Antonio Brown step for step down the sideline. I like seeing that. I've really liked what I've seen from Marlon Humphrey. Has he been perfect? No, but he absolutely, as someone that wasn't exactly enthused by that pick, he, to this point, has looked the part of a guy who is on his way to having a chance to be in a shutdown corner. And I think it's going to be interesting as the year goes on. And that's not to say that Brandon Carr has been bad. I think Brandon Carr has had his issues, certainly gave up the long pass play on the first play from scrimmage last week against Jacksonville. He's let some receivers get behind him. Overall, I think he's been solid. I don't think it's necessarily a commentary on him playing poorly, but I think I'm starting to wonder how much longer can you keep Marlon Humphrey off the field. And maybe that means Brandon Carr slides inside to play some more nickel. Maybe that's a solution to, maybe if Webb's not going to play at a high enough level, which, I think that's still up in the air right now. But if there is a bright spot as far as their young guys, Humphrey's the guy at the top of the list. Yeah, we've seen some other guys flash. Tyus Bowser played really well against Cleveland, did not play well against Jacksonville. We've seen Tim Williams in some very limited opportunities flash as a pass rusher, so I think there's some potential there. But of all these young guys that you're kind of looking to step forward, Marlon Humphrey is the guy that I would also agree with you he's looked the part, and I think he's looked really good. Also, keep in mind, this guy missed a large portion of the preseason as well. So for him to play as well as he has to this point, that's pretty encouraging. Not necessarily paying major dividends for 2017, but very, very encouraging for the future.
Luke, it feels like every time there's a car crash out there, we're looking up and Stanley's injured and Weddle's in the blue 10 and Zadarius Smith. I mean, the injuries and I guess the breath holding that goes on with each and every play. I mean, Ben Watson at one point. It's been going on once a quarter. It feels like somebody's going off, right?
Yeah, and I mean it's. Some of them you're not going to prevent. This is a game of attrition. There is certainly some bad luck involved. I mean, what happened to Marshall Yanda a few weeks ago? I don't know how you prevent that. I don't know how you prevent someone falling into an offensive lineman's ankle and basically crushing it. I mean, you're going to have some of that. I know I've been asked this question so much as far as what are the Ravens doing? Have they done any self-analysis of this? Well, they revamped their off-season training program last year because or with the thought of trying to reduce some of the injuries. Now, that said, that doesn't mean they've hit the target. That doesn't mean that they've cracked the code to try to limit the number of injuries. Is luck involved? Sure. Some of these injuries can't be prevented. I mean, I've seen some of them firsthand. There's nothing that you can do from a conditioning standpoint if someone's leg gets snapped or something along those lines. But is there something they're still missing in their training? Is there something they're missing in their recovery? Is there something missing with the shoes and the spikes they're using? I mean, these are all things that I've asked questions, and I think we'll
and they are too, by the way. I mean, they're not fools about this. It's not like they don't have analytics, and it's not like they don't have all their money invested in saying when we don't have Marshall Yanda and Brandon Williams and Dennis Pitta and Tavon. You just go down the list and.
Sure.
They're paying these guys. They want them on the field. Bisciotti certainly wants them on the field.
Yeah, and I mean, even, you go to the draft. I mean, I know from talking to someone who used to be, in their scouting department a few years back. I mean, and he was at the bottom of the totem pole. He talked about the fact that all they had him do was watch college tape and chart the number of plays that players played and injuries, times they left the game, talking about draft prospects. So the health and wanting to draft players that don't get injured. I mean, that's something that they've been trying to pinpoint. That's something that they've been trying to perfect. I mean, you've seen some of the injuries they've had with some of these players coming out of college. Some of these guys were very, very durable in college. So, you wonder, is it an issue of some of them played too much in college? I mean, is there a possibility with that? I mean, I don't know what the exact answer is, but it is pretty incredible that, and fortunately, at least coming out of the game, immediately coming out of the game, doesn't appear that they suffered any major injuries, but, you do see Ronnie Stanley go out for a while. You do see Eric Weddle go out for a while. You see Ben Watson evaluated for a concussion, and I saw Jeremy Maclin had his hand wrapped after the game. I mean, it's in the locker room. So
it's a violent game, dude. Right? We see it up close. It really is.
I mean, but at the same time, I understand fans' frustration. I understand the organization's frustration with it's been so many years in a row now. I mean, you're talking going on 4 or 5 years now where they have had an incredible number of injuries, and this year specifically having so many so soon. You have to ask questions. If you're not, and you're only chalking it up to luck, and you're not going to be vigilant in looking at everything you do, from equipment to recovery to the field, everything, you have to do that, because if there is something they're missing that they can improve, they need to do it, because as much as I beat up their approach in the offseason with the offense, and I will stand by that till I'm blue in the face, you look at the number of injuries they've had, it has completely derailed what their ceiling could have been. Not that I thought their ceiling was great on the offensive side of the ball, but now when you look at the injuries they've had, how high can it be? I don't think it's that high, quite frankly. And defensively, even though fortunately to this point they haven't had as many season-ending injuries to that side of the ball, now with Brandon Williams having been sidelined a couple weeks, we've seen how they fared without him, replacing Brent Urban. Tavon Young they lost back at the beginning of June. Even there, it limits your ceiling, it limits your potential as a football team. As much as you love to hear that slogan, next man up, it sounds great. Put it on a T-shirt, right? The reality is, you can't just continue to plug in player after player after player and expect there not to be some significant drop-off after a while. We saw this plain as day in 2015, but you really worry that what we're seeing on the offense, and let's say Brandon Williams misses a couple more games, what impact that has. Now you're starting to really put yourself in a hole, and you don't want to be sitting at 2-4, 3-5, knowing that you need to do incredible work the second half of the season just to try to sneak in as a wild card. So they're definitely the health has been a frustrating thing. There's no doubt, and I don't want to discredit that. There have been plenty of other reasons why they've had issues on both sides of the ball, but the injuries have certainly been a big part of that narrative. There's no doubt.
Steelers now in the driver's seat. Just last thing on them, because we're going to get to the whole league and everything that's going on around the league and how it affects the Ravens in regard to wild card and all the other stuff. But the Steelers are clearly the class of the division here, and they're going to probably be holding that mantle. And look, you can look at their schedule and say, well, they're playing a tougher schedule this year, and they are. And I think that's that'll bear witness if you go check it out. But by and large, I mean, they got to go to Kansas City in 2 weeks. We got to go to Oakland this week. It's all this east-west or northwest stuff this year. Just some thoughts on the Steelers, because they're going to be playing in January, I guess, because if they're not, we are, and it's hard to believe we are right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot can change. I mean, we're talking about 4 games into the season. I mean, at this time a year ago, the Ravens were 3-1, and we saw how that ended up going downhill pretty quickly, and then they were playing catch-up after that. So you never want to read too much into it, but based on what we've seen, am I convinced Pittsburgh's going to win 12 or 13 games? Absolutely not. I think they clearly have some issues, but you saw their offense looking more like what you expected. I mean, there were people talking before the season about Pittsburgh having the most talented offense in the NFL. I mean, you look at their skill position players, you look at the fact that they get Martavis Bryant back, you look at the fact that their offensive line is improved from where it was 3 or 4 years ago. And even with Ben Roethlisberger getting older, you just look at that talent, and especially compared to the Ravens, I don't think it's particularly close. Their defense has certainly had its issues stopping the run, and we saw that with Alex Collins running the ball very effectively against them, even with his fumble taken into account. He averaged 9.1 yards per carry, broke the 50-yarder. That clearly was the big play on the scoring drive. But I think that's a Pittsburgh defense that, while it's hardly elite, I think that group is better than it's been here of late. And the Steelers have been an offensive-minded team here recently. Guys like where James Harrison was in his prime, and Troy Polamalu still playing at a high level. All those guys are basically gone. Harrison's been a non-factor for them so far this year. He's barely played. Was inactive on Sunday because of an illness, but he's hardly played as it is. So, but they've got some young players. Certainly gave the Ravens offensive line fits. I'm not sure how great of a barometer that is in terms of talking about their overall quality. But one factor, and I'm not the one who did the research on this, but I've seen it cited a few times this week. Pittsburgh doesn't have a whole lot of travel this year. When you look at the Ravens traveling, obviously to London, they're going to travel to Oakland across the country next week. Pittsburgh's travel, their mileage a little bit down compared to some other teams in this league. That's a factor. That helps. They're a team, much like the Ravens, that hasn't been overly impressive on the road over the last few years. They're a team like the Ravens until Sunday, who are very tough playing in their home stadium. So, when it's all said and done, if you ask me to predict right now, 10, maybe 11 wins. But
hang on a second. They play 3 out of 4 on the road, and they're 3-1. That's pretty good.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Pretty
you're
good.
Right. I want to give them credit for that. I'm just saying, based on what we see right now, the eyeball test. Are they an 11-win team? Okay, I'd sign off on that. Not quite convinced that they're better than that, but teams can get better. Just like the Ravens, and fans in town here will certainly hope the Ravens get much better, specifically on the offensive side of the ball. But defensively, they got to get back to what they were doing weeks 1 and 2. We knew they weren't going to force 5 takeaways a game. That just was not going to be sustainable. That's like talking about a baseball, a lineup that's scoring 10 or 11 runs a game over a period of 10 days.
Or like pitching that every guy in the rotation could have an ERA of 7 at the All-Star break. Yeah. I thought that was impossible too, Luke.
I know, right? But
I got to throw my cheap shot in now. They didn't even get to 77, dude. I had them at 7. People were crushing me back in April because I said 77 wins. They didn't even get to 77. This tanking the last couple of weeks. We'll get to it, but I just got.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. But I feel like as the Orioles season mercifully comes to an end, I feel like the Orioles starting pitching has become the Ravens offense as far as source of frustration
Fair
here
enough.
in town.
Fair enough.
But a lot of season left. There's no doubt about that. A lot can change. All it takes is one injury to the wrong player. Roethlisberger goes down, Le'Veon Bell goes down, Antonio Brown goes down. I'm not saying you're wishing that. I think it's low class to wish something like that. But it's just acknowledging the reality. Something like that happens, then the outlook of this division changes dramatically. But yeah, to this point, it's hard not to look at Pittsburgh as the class of the division, with the Ravens winning those 2 games, but having looked so miserable in the 2 games since then, wipes away any of those good vibes. And let's face it, Cincinnati and Cleveland to this point have both been pretty nightmarish in terms of how they've played.
And the Ravens have only been nightmarish for 2 hours or so, right?
Right. So we'll see how this plays out. A lot of football left, but Pittsburgh right now they're in the driver's seat just from a standpoint of the Ravens were not able to hold serve at home, and when they go to Pittsburgh in early December, you hope that it's a game that means something. If it is a game that means something, they're going to have Pittsburgh's going to have the home field advantage there and have a chance to sweep and earn that tiebreaker for going into the end of the seasons. But Ravens can't worry about that. They gotta take a long look in the mirror and figure out coaches, players. I don't know how much you can do as far as adding any players at this point. If you're the front office, that ship's kind of sailed considering their lack of cap space, and I think the lack of just solutions that are even out there available. But coaches and players, they got to figure this thing out because it has not been nearly good enough these last 2 weeks. And frankly, especially in the first half, that was embarrassing on Sunday, playing your AFC North rival and having that kind of a showing in the first half. Not good.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter, as well as Luke at WNST.net. You can always find me, Nasty, at WNST.net. The Ravens will be back on the backfields in Owings Mills all week long. Luke will be monitoring that. I'm sure he and I will be talking and tweeting and thinking and writing about baseball and the baseball playoffs as well. You can find all of our work all week long in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. Our morning newspaper ships to your email inbox each and every morning at 7 a.m. That's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life, and that's an absolute guarantee. And last but never least, if there's any breaking news this week on injuries, updates, Brandon Williams getting ready for the Oakland game, you'll get it all first on the WNST text service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And, of course, Dennis Kolatzis will be here with the SSV on WNST. That'll be heard Thursday from 3 until 5. I am Nestor. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.